many times, Lord.
Hey everyone, this is Travis here with Groundbreakers Life, or Groundbreakers to Harvesters. Thank you again for checking us out. I'm having conversations with Gerry Harrow about church planting, the apostolic approach to church planting, and what makes it unique, and how to kind of get this thing up and running. We've been in this conversation for a few weeks now. The first week, if you want to kind of go back and look at it, Gerry and I talked about how we kind of got into this journey, why church planting when there's so many different opportunities and roles to serve within the church. And then last week, we talked on a very, very high level just about apostolic church planting and that approach and how it kind of compares and contrasts to some of the other church planting approaches that are out there. We are not saying it's better. We're just offering it up as another opportunity, depending on how the church planter is wired, might be a blessing to them and the church at large. So with that in mind, I want to welcome Gerry to the screen. And Gerry, did I do a good summary there? Like, fill in the gaps. What do we?
I think
so.
I think it's great. I think, as we talked about last time, there's just so many different models out there, and depending on the situation that you're in and the people that God has brought into that situation, you got to consider each one of those, and each one of them has its pluses and minuses. I think we talked about,
Right.
and you and I talked, I think we're going to dig deeper into the apostolic model a little bit later, because that's one that maybe, even though it's not new, it's something that not everybody's been used to seeing. So we're going to dig more into that later.
Absolutely. And today we're going to actually jump ahead about 6 months into the church planting process. So there's a whole host of things we're going to skip. If you're trying to do this chronologically, like, okay, what do I do this week with church planting? Not going to happen today. So what we're missing, or what we're skipping, is the season where your job is to go and make good friends with partner churches. And that's not just for funding, that's for celebration, that's for prayer support, and that's for cultivating some of those groundbreaking families to come and join you. And then we're even going to kind of skip, how do you build community amongst these strangers, these groundbreaker families, and take them from their different traditions and their different churches that may or may not have bad blood between each other, and get them in a room to actually love and care for each other as disciples are. We're kind of skipping those two conversations. We'll come back, trust me. And we're going to what I think is particularly this time of year, the most important conversation for a church plant, and those moments leading up to what so many people are passionate about, and that is, when are you going to start Sunday morning worship? Right, Gerry? Isn't that something that we fight against?
Next week, right? Next week.
Right. But that's the big question that everyone asks. Like, now that we're doing this, everyone starts asking, well, when are you going to do Sunday morning worship? And I think, Gerry, you really, probably 5 months ago when we were starting to talk about this, we're really having to push back at some of your partner churches and some of your groundbreaker families, because they wanted to jump to worship. And what you and I both know is, if you get to worship too soon, it's really hard to backfill some of the foundational things that a church plant in our culture today really needs to get and understand. So tell me some of your experience with that tension of trying to get to worship too soon, and why it's important to not rush that process.
It is very difficult in a lot of respects, because we know that in our tribe, that's where we get fed. The Word and Sacrament Ministries, that's how we get actually the giftedness and the tools and the strength and all of the things to go out and be His people in the world. So it's such a powerful thing to have worship. But the challenge is if you go directly to worship and you don't spend time on building relationships, understanding the people in the community, the leaders, just all of those types of things, then when you go back to try to build maybe a small group culture, if you want to call it that, or this whole kind of this organic relationship that God has given us in community, it's really hard to do, because you've got worship. And that's what people come for. And yeah, it's a challenge.
Well, and it's not just what people come for. It's it becomes the tail that wags the dog. And I don't mean to minimize the importance of worship. It is essential. I mean, this is where word and sacrament take place. This is where the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed. This is where we engage in the sacraments. Totally, absolutely important. But when that starts to be put on the calendar, all of your energy and resources get focused on that. And one of the things that I realized with our first church plant in Allen, Texas, was we really wanted to be a community that was passionate for the de-churched. Those people who had been in church, maybe been hurt by church, or just life got busy and they fell out of church. And we went to worship fairly quick, and we didn't do a lot of time listening to the community and listening to those folks that have that story. And what I realized is we are creatures of habit, and we love to hang out with people we already hang out with. And when you establish Sunday morning worship and those friendships and those relationships are there, we would have conversations like, okay, who do you know in your neighborhood that maybe doesn't go to church? And they're like, well, all my friends go to the church. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Nothing wrong with that. But if you don't have a heart and a rhythm, and I think that's the key word, a rhythm of actually engaging with and encountering folks who are not a part of the church, it's almost impossible to get that back. Because as soon as you do worship, you got children's ministry, you got to figure out, who's going to be on your praise team, who's going to be doing your AV. You need a setup crew, you need a teardown crew. And then somewhere in the midst of that, you also need, your small group crew, and everyone has a job. And so everyone's, if you get 3 hours a week for someone to engage in spiritual church stuff, 2 hours are on Sunday morning because you got set up, worship, and then possibly tear down. And then 1 hour during the week, which for many in a small church plant where the resources are so limited, it is consumed with volunteering and preparing something else. And so I think what you and I are saying is everyone's going to push you towards worship. We get that. Here's something to do before then. And the longer you can spend with your community in this posture, I think the better it will be. And so you kind of have coined the term, listen to your community. And so I would love to know the high level, what are your goals when you talk about listening to your community? What are your goals with that? And how do you approach it in such a way that your community is engaging in that on a regular basis? Not because, Gerry said I have to do it this week, but because it becomes a part of their heartbeat. And then the next podcast, we're going to talk about, well, who do you listen to, and what are the different unique challenges as you listen to them to begin to discover God's mission through those people?
I believe community listening is probably one of the hardest things to do, but probably one of the most powerful things to do, especially early on in the process. And then as you go forward as a church, who we are the church, not the building, but we are the church, you also get a chance to see God at work. You see where he wants you to move. So you've got to be nimble in that too. But stepping back at a high level, community listening really is just being a part of the community in a very real way, and understanding the needs, understanding the challenges of the people who live there, the businesses, the city, and then really trying to understand where maybe the people of the church that is forming, what giftedness they have coming into it, what passions they have, and then understand how that fits with what the community maybe is needing, and seeing where there's maybe a hole. And ultimately, I think it really helps you see where God is leading you to be his hands and feet in that, and his kingdom in that particular community. And kind of where all that intersects is that sweet spot. And what you hope to be able to do is to find that sweet spot. Where are the needs in the community? Where are we being gifted? What is God leading us to? And then, man, that's where you should be as a church. That's pretty high level, but it's pretty, that's kind of what it is, right?
It is. And I love how you kind of summed it up saying, man, if you can get these, and this is truth for every church. It is not just truth for church
Exactly.
plant. If you can identify the needs of your community and discover the gifts that God has already placed in the hearts of your people, and the Spirit stirs a passion for that, man, the doors won't be able to hold out the number of people that want to be in and involved in that community. And I think, one of the things, I think one of the things that makes that easier with a church plant, and I would encourage guys that maybe are in a more traditional church setting, here's something that maybe you can incorporate somehow into your mission rhythm and your life rhythm, is we don't have a building, which means we don't have an office. Which means that Gerry and I spend most of our time either in our homes or finding a place in the community to sit down with a laptop and just get work done. And there is something powerful when you have the rhythm of being able to be in the same place on a regular basis, to see the same people, begin that long journey of building a trusting relationship with them, and then they figure out that you're a pastor, and then the wheels come flying off because they're like, I've known you for 3 months and now I find out you're a pastor. And then they start having those conversations that they've wanted to have with someone, but they didn't trust anyone except for you. And so I think, if we're going to be listening to our community, one of the things that I would highly recommend is that means spending time in the community. Find a place. I'll never forget, I was meeting with a vicar who had a heart for church planting, and he really wanted to connect with the unchurched and the de-churched. And he had read a bunch of books on it, and one of the themes that kept coming up was how important coffee shops are, or third space, or green space, or whatever you wanted to say it. And so he was spending all this, what little time he had that was free time, he'd spend in the coffee shops. And he was getting so frustrated and so just discouraged because he's like, I'm not meeting anyone. And I was like, well, have you noticed what people do in a coffee shop? They don't interact with other people. Like if you're in a coffee shop, you're there to get something done or to meet with someone, but not just interact with the population. And he goes, oh, okay. I said, and let me ask you, I've never seen you drink coffee. Do you actually like coffee? He's like, no, I hate coffee. I was like, why are you spending time in a coffee shop?
Oh my goodness.
You hate coffee. Right? He goes, well, it's just what everyone said. I said, okay. And I knew this guy from when he was in college. And so I was like, okay, you are a musician. You love to play drums. Are you gigging someplace on a Friday night? He goes, no. I said, why? I know you can't do it on Saturday. You got church responsibilities on Sunday. I get it. You are a drummer. You should be gigging. You want to listen to your community? Find out where they're at on a Friday night and be the drummer in that location. I promise you, you will get to know some unchurched and de-churched people there. And then he discovered that he loved rock climbing. And so he joined a rock gym, and he spent like 2 nights there a week. He got engaged in a community, and all of a sudden he became the pastor for that rock gym, because people who go to rock gyms don't typically, they're just a subculture there that he was able to get into because he was willing to engage in them repeatedly. He loved it. It was infectious. And he was able to share like those moments with them and listen to them, and then they were willing and able to share with him, and it turned out to be a beautiful thing. And so, as we talk about listening to your community, I can't encourage you enough. Actually spend time in the community doing something you love to do, right? So, Gerry, what have you found personally that has allowed you to make inroads in listening to the community as you've spent time there?
Well, going the theme that you just talked about is maybe a community place that you love doing what you're doing. As you and I've talked, we bought a sailboat about a year ago and joined a yeah, right,
take
exactly.
me away to where I'm going. You're so living your 70s dreams right now. I love it.
Yeah, don't quit your day job for singing, okay?
10-4, my man, 10-4.
And so there's this kind of a little yacht club, and I've joined that, and that's been really fun, just getting to know the guys and talking to them and talking about sailing and boats and all of that. And so that's been kind of an area that I've been, and they've started asking me to participate in some things on the spiritual side, and that's amazing.
Yes.
Also have a friend that's he's a big car guy, and he's a head of this hot rod association around here, and so I've got to know him really well and got to be really good friends with him. Him and his friend has started teaching me how to weld. And
Nice.
in the midst of all of that, because I've always wanted to learn how to weld, I've just never learned how, and so it's been kind of fun to try that. But he now will call me at times, and he's asked me to go to a funeral with him. He asked me to go up to hospital and pray with one of his buddies, and it's just because I'm there, not a bait and switch to get him somewhere or to, get him converted or any of that. It's just because I really enjoy his company, and he's a good friend of mine, and that relationship's been built, and I understand what their community is really struggling with. And it's because they've let me, some people, they said they've invited me into their boat,
Yeah.
and,
yeah.
And that's a cool thing to do. And that's just a piece of community listening. And that's in a very small piece, right? In your own, where God has kind of placed you, your interests and that. I love what Greg Finke said in his book, Joining Jesus. He just talks about God has already prepared everything, right? He's already did some of the groundbreaking. And you just need to go and join him there. And you don't have to figure out where to go. You just need to join him where he's already prepared for you. And that's in your neighborhoods, that's in your work, that's in your hobbies, that's in all those places, and you go join him. And that makes it so much easier, isn't it?
It does. And I think, what as you're talking, what I'm reminded of is, don't be overwhelmed by the macro of this. Listen to your community. Like, your community could be a handful of people that you coach the little league team with. As you're listening to the dads before or after practice and what's going on, and after you get the game plan put together, then listening to them about their work, you begin to understand their stresses and their pinch points. And so don't get overwhelmed with the macro. Find your micro area where you have a passion already, and people will trust you in there. For me, it's cigar shops, and I love being in cigar shops. I love talking to guys, and then they finally get around asking me what I do, and I always tell them, it's like, you don't want to know what I do, and they're like, oh, and then they think I work for the CIA, and I'm like, no, it's nothing like that. I'm a pastor, and the room will drop dead silent. Because every one of them is going to sit there and go through, how many cuss words did I use in the last 5 to 10 minutes? And then I'll remind them, I was like, I don't tell you this because I want to know who you are. I don't want to know who you think I want you to be. And the good news is, almost always, universally, within the next 10 minutes, they're back to cussing the way that they did beforehand. So I know that that is. But to find that place, and I think that's, again, why the church plant is successful in some of these areas where the other larger churches isn't, is because we don't have a lot of church activities that are not necessarily bad or wrong, but they take people away from the community to invest in the church. And again, not bad or wrong, but if we are passionate about the unchurched and the de-churched, the people who are God is preparing in their hearts to hear the good news about Jesus and the forgiveness of sins, then we have to be willing to go to the town squares and hang out with them and just be with them. And that might mean taking your normal Bible study evening and going someplace else instead of a Bible study to just get to know people, or investing in a karate club, or the list is limitless. And it's a mind shift. And that's why you and I, we spend so much time on this with a new church plant, because for most people who come from a church setting, success for us is defined by the number of people who show up to an event or a place in a specific time, and it's the church. And what you and I know, that if we're going to really get to people who currently aren't engaged in church, our success and our matrix of success has to shift away from that. And it has to become, how much time am I hanging out with people who I don't get eternity with because they don't know the good news about Jesus? And that becomes success, not I get to hang out with people who I already get eternity with, and we're just getting to pregame right now in this Bible study. Does that make sense at all? Like, help unpack that some more.
Yeah, I mean, it does to me. That's the key, in giving people permission to be God's hands and feet where God has put them. I think so often people take on this responsibility that I've got to be this evangelist, and I've got to do all these things to bring people and to bring him to church and all that. And if there's no church to bring him to, what am I going to do? I can't invite him to church with me. All right. So what do I do with this?
And the pastor's going to seal the deal. He's the real evangelist,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. But I'm going to divert a little bit though, because you talked about this macro thing,
Yeah.
And I'm not going to let you or anybody off the hook on that. Because the reality is if you think about, if we are the church as individuals coming together collectively, then each one of our little stories that we find in our community listening ultimately paints a picture of what this new church really maybe should be about. So it can't be just the church plant pastor going out and checking out, and meeting with community leaders and hearing all this, but it's the team members that are out there in their neighborhoods with their preschool people, with their sports and all of these things. And all of a sudden now we come together as a leadership team, as a church plant leadership team, and say, man, there seems to be some commonality here that we really are sensing God is leading us to be this in this community. And I think that's an important thing to think. Yes, it's individuals, but there is this macro view that ultimately what we hope to be able to figure out so that we can be faithful in following God and what he's calling us to do in that community.
Absolutely nailing it. And I appreciate and I thank you for that, because it's all these little micro stories that will add into the macro reality of the mission of the church. And and I think that's another shift is the vision, the mission of the church really should come from the people of the church, not just the pastor of the church. And often we lay it at the foot of the pastor of like, well, what's your mission? And the apostolic church planting approach is different, where you and I, our job is to go into a community of believers and help them discover the mission that God is laying on their hearts, not trying to convince them of like, this is what I think is important, so this is what we need to do. It is helping them discover that, because we're asking the questions. We're tying threads together that they're not necessarily seeing or tying together, and we're seeing them and we're able to tie them together. And then you see these light bulbs come on and you're like, oh my gosh, we have all this in common. We should do something about this. Like, we had a meeting with one of our, some of our church planting families, right? And we were just talking about life and everything else. And it was over dinner and we having a great time. I think it was second glass of wine had been poured, and all of a sudden what we realized is every single one of us in this room had some sort of intimate adoption story. Either we were adopted, or we had a sibling that was adopted, or someone close in our family was adopted. And it was like, holy smokes. There's no way in our culture that's prevalent enough that all of us in this room right now have that same thing in common. And for us as the apostolic leaders to kind of point out and say, that's not by accident. God might be putting on our hearts a unique mission for this culture, for this church to really impact that. And that's what we're talking about. And so, as we wrap up the conversation, I'm going to kick it over to you in just a second, Gerry, but we cannot encourage you enough, whether you are an established church or you are a church plant, to embrace this, listening to your community, spending time in your community, and then creating space for people to share the stories of what they're hearing and what they're experiencing from the community, so that threads can be discovered and be tied together, and we can see what God has in store for us. So, Gerry, I'll give you the last thought as we wrap up our time together on Groundbreakers to Harvesters.
So along those same lines, when you start sharing the stories, what an encouragement that is for each other, and what an excitement that starts building when you get to hear God working over here, and there's a commonality with God's working over here,
Yep.
and you're sharing all these stories, and you're seeing, your eyes are being opened even more to see where God's working, where God is leading, and just God's faithfulness and all of it. It's just an exciting thing that starts happening the more and more you do this. And then on top of it, what I really think is important, and I would encourage everybody who's listening or watching this, is just be committed to being lifelong learners, lifelong listeners to your communities. Because the minute you start thinking you've got it all figured out and you've got it all set and everything starts gelling and the concrete starts getting hard, you need to really start thinking, because God has a lot of stuff in store for all of us. And we need to be nimble. We need to be constantly looking and watching and listening to where he's moving in the area, so you can continue to learn and just to join him. It's an exciting, we talked about it. It's an exciting but challenging journey, but that's part of what this whole community listening is all about, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree, and you mentioned it, and so I'm going to plug it real quick. A really good, faithful, just amazing author, actually. Greg Finke wrote a book called Joining Jesus, and he has some secondary and supporting books to that, and I can't recommend that highly enough. In fact, it's one of the books that we take our Groundbreaker families through in training, of just these really simple, practical ways to not bring something new into your life, but to like re-envision things that you're already doing through the lens of joining Jesus in his work. And so you mentioned the book. I'll throw it out there. If you haven't read it yet, I really encourage you to, I know we both encourage you to pick it up and read through it and dive into it. I know we're Facebook friends, Finky and I, and he's always, within moments of me reaching out to him with a question or an idea, he's always responded quickly. So I know he loves to share the story and get people joining Jesus on that journey. So anyways, thank you guys so much for being with us today. Really, really do appreciate it. As always, next week we're going to talk strategy on how to actually develop the rhythm of being a lifelong listener in your community. And so you don't want to miss that. Tune in for that. I want to thank Gerry for just his ministry and experience. As always, check us out on groundbreakerslife.com. You can listen to the podcast in any number of areas, and please join us as a friend on Facebook. And if it's in your heart, man, give us a rating. We'd love it, and share the story. God bless you guys, and we will see you soon.